Chapter 23 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Howard's End by Edward Morgan Forster. Chapter 23. Margaret had no intention of letting things slide. And the evening before she left Swanage, she gave her sister a thorough scolding. She censured her, not for disapproving of the engagement, but for throwing over her disapproval a veil of mystery. Helen was equally frank. "Yes," she said, with an air of one looking inwards, "there is a mystery. I can't help it. It's not my fault. It's the way life has been made." Helen in those days was over-interested in the subconscious self. She exaggerated the Punch and Judy aspect of life, and spoke of mankind as puppets, whom an invisible showman twitches into love and war. Margaret pointed out that if she dwelt on this, she too would eliminate the personal. Helen was silent for a minute, and then burst into a queer speech, which cleared the air. "Go on and marry him. I think you're splendid, and if anyone can pull it off, you will." Margaret denied that there was anything to pull off, but she continued, "Yes, there is, and I wasn't up to it with Paul. I can only do what's easy. I can only entice and be enticed. I can't and won't attempt difficult relations. If I marry, it'll either be a man who's strong enough to boss me, or whom I'm strong enough to boss. So I shan't ever marry, for there aren't such men. And heaven help anyone whom I do marry, for I shall certainly run away from him before you can say Jack Robinson. There, because I'm uneducated. But you're different. You're a heroine." "Oh, Helen, am I? It'd be as dreadful for poor Henry as all that." "You mean to keep proportion, and that's heroic. It's Greek, and I don't see why it shouldn't succeed with you. Go on and fight with him, and help him. Don't ask me for help, or even for sympathy. Henceforth I'm going my own way. I mean to be thorough, because thoroughness is easy. I mean to dislike your husband, and to tell him so. I mean to make no concessions to Tibby. If Tibby wants to live with me, he must lump me. I mean to love you more than ever. Yes, I do. You and I have built up something real, because it is purely spiritual. There's no veil of mystery over us. Unreality and mystery begin as soon as one touches the body. The popular view is, as usual, exactly the wrong one. Our bothers are over tangible things, money, husbands, house hunting. But heaven will work of itself." Margaret was grateful for this expression of affection, and answered, "Perhaps." All vistas close in the unseen. No one doubts it, but Helen closed them rather too quickly for her taste. At every turn of speech one was confronted with reality and the absolute. Perhaps Margaret grew too old for metaphysics, and perhaps Henry was weaning her from them. But she felt that there was something a little unbalanced in the mind that so readily shreds the visible. The business man who assumes that this life is everything, and the mystic who asserts that it is nothing, fail, on this side and on that, to hit the truth. "Yes, I see, dear. It's about halfway between," Aunt Julie had hazarded in earlier years. No, truth, being alive, was not halfway between anything. It was only to be found by continuous excursions into either realm, and though proportion is the final secret, to espouse it at the outset is to ensure sterility. Helen, agreeing here, disagreeing there, would have talked till midnight, but Margaret, who, with her packing to do, focused the conversation on Henry. She might abuse Henry behind his back, but please would she always be civil to him in company. "I definitely dislike him, but I'll do what I can," promised Helen. "Do what you can with my friends in return." This conversation made Margaret easier. Their inner life was so safe that they could bargain over externals in a way that would have been incredible to Aunt Julie, and impossible for Tibby or Charles. There are moments when the inner life actually pays, when years of self-scrutiny, conducted for no ulterior motive, are suddenly of practical use. Such moments are still rare in the West. That they come at all promises a fairer future. Margaret, though unable to understand her sister, was assured against estrangement, and returned to London with a more peaceful mind. The following morning, at 11 o'clock, she presented herself at the offices of the Imperial and West African Rubber Company. She was glad to go there, for Henry had implied his business rather than described it, and the formlessness and vagueness that one associates with Africa had hitherto brooded over the main sources of his wealth. Not that a visit to the office cleared things up. They were just the ordinary surface scum of ledgers and polished counters and brass bars that began and stopped for no possible reason, of electric light globes blossoming in triplets, of little rabbit hutches faced with glass or wire, of little rabbits. And even when she penetrated to the inner depths, she found only the ordinary table and Turkey carpet. And though the map over the fireplace did depict a helping of West Africa, it was a very ordinary map. Another map hung opposite, on which the whole continent appeared, looking like a whale marked out for blubber, and by its side was a door, shut, but Henry's voice came through it, dictating a strong letter. She might have been at the Porphyrion, or Dempster's Bank, or her own wine merchant's. Everything seems just alike in these days. But perhaps she was seeing the imperial side of the company, rather than its West African, and imperialism always had been one of her difficulties. 1 minute, called Mr. Wilcox, on receiving her name. He touched a bell, the effect of which was to produce Charles. Charles had written his father an adequate letter, more adequate than Evie's, through which a girlish indignation throbbed, and he greeted his future stepmother with propriety. "I hope that my wife, how do you do, will give you a decent lunch," was his opening. "I left instructions, but we live in a rough and ready way. Expects you back to tea, too, after you've had a look at Howard's End. I wonder what you'll think of the place. I wouldn't touch it with tongs myself. Do sit down. It's a measly little place." "I shall enjoy seeing it," said Margaret, feeling, for the first time, shy. "You'll see it at its worst. But Bryce decamped abroad last Monday without even arranging for a charwoman to clean up after him. I never saw such a disgraceful mess. It's unbelievable. He wasn't in the house a month." "I've got more than a little bone to pick with Bryce," called Henry from the inner chamber. "Why did he go so suddenly?" "Invalid type. Couldn't sleep." "Poor fellow." "Poor fiddlesticks," said Mr. Wilcox, joining them. "He had the impudence to put up notice boards, without as much saying 'with your leave' or 'by your leave.' Charles flung them down." "Yes, I flung them down," said Charles, modestly. "I've sent a telegram after him, and a pretty sharp one, too. He, and he in person, is responsible for the upkeep of that house for the next 3 years. The keys are at the farm. We wouldn't have the keys." "Quite right. Dolly would have taken them, but I was in, fortunately." "What's Mr. Bryce like?" asked Margaret. But nobody cared. Mr. Bryce was the tenant, who had no right to sublet. To have defined him further was a waste of time. On his misdeeds they descanted profusely, until the girl who had been typing the strong letter came out with it. Mr. Wilcox added his signature. "Now we'll be off," said he. A motor drive, a form of felicity detested by Margaret, awaited her. Charles saw them in, civil to the last, and in a moment the offices of the Imperial and West African Rubber Company faded away. But it was not an impressive drive. Perhaps the weather was to blame, being grey and banked high with weary clouds. Perhaps Hertfordshire is scarcely intended for motorists. Did not a gentleman once motor so quickly through Westmoreland that he missed it? And if Westmoreland can be missed, it will fare ill with a county whose delicate structure particularly needs the attentive eye. Hertfordshire is England at its quietest, with little emphasis of river and hill. It is England meditative. If Drayton were with us again to write a new edition of his incomparable poem, he would sing the nymphs of Hertfordshire as indeterminate of feature